The winner is John Wayne in True Blood.
There are Hollywood legends, and then there is John Wayne. For more than 4 decades, he dominated the silver screen with a swagger that felt less like acting and more like a force of nature. Audiences packed theaters to watch him ride into the sunset, fire his six-shooter, and deliver lines with that unmistakable drawl that became the soundtrack of American cinema. But here is what most people never knew while they were watching him. John Wayne was quietly building something that would outlast every film he ever made. He was constructing a financial empire, one careful investment at a time, one shrewd business decision after another. And when he finally passed away on June 11th, 1979, the true scale of what he had built left Hollywood stunned. The fortune he left behind was staggering, and its ripple effects would enrich his family for generations to come. To understand how John Wayne became one of the wealthiest self-made stars in Hollywood history, you have to go back to the very beginning, to a small house in Winterset, Iowa, where on May 26, 1907, a boy named Marion Robert Morrison came into the world. There was nothing glamorous about his origins. His father, Clyde Leonard Morrison, was a pharmacist who struggled to keep his family afloat. His mother, Mary Alberta Brown, was a tough, practical woman who kept the household running through sheer willpower. Life was modest, and luxuries were rare. When Marion was still a young boy, the Morrison family packed up and moved to Glendale, California, chasing the promise of better weather and a fresh start. It was in Glendale that Marion picked up the nickname that would follow him the rest of his life. He had a large Airedale Terrier named Duke, and the two were inseparable. Local firefighters at the station near his home began calling the boy Little Duke, and the dog Big Duke. Marion Morrison preferred the name Duke to his own, and it stuck permanently. The name suited him far better anyway. Marion sounded gentle. Duke sounded like someone you did not want to cross. As a teenager, Duke threw himself into football with extraordinary dedication. At Glendale High School, he became a standout player, good enough to earn a football scholarship to the University of Southern California. For a kid from a working-class family, this was a life-altering opportunity. He arrived at USC in 1925 full of ambition and drive, determined to make something of himself. But fate intervened brutally. A body surfing accident left him with a severely injured shoulder, stripping him of his scholarship and effectively ending his football career before it truly began. Just like that, the future he had mapped out for himself was gone. Losing his scholarship could have destroyed Duke Morrison. For many young men, that kind of setback would have meant retreating home in defeat. But Duke had something inside him that refused to quit. His old USC football coach, Howard Jones, helped connect him with Tom Mix, a popular Western film star who had ties to the Fox Film Corporation. Through that connection, Duke landed a job at the studio, working as a prop boy and general labor behind the scenes. The pay was minimal, the work was unglamorous, but it put him inside the machine. It was at Fox that Duke crossed paths with a director named John Ford, a meeting that would change the trajectory of his entire life. Ford noticed something about the young prop boy that others overlooked. There was a physical presence to Duke Morrison, a natural authority, an ease in his own body that the camera would love. Ford took him under his wing, gave him bit parts, and began shaping him for something bigger. Their friendship deepened into one of the most productive director-actor partnerships Hollywood has ever seen. Duke's first credited film appearance came in 1928 in a movie called Mother Machree, directed by John Ford. His role was absurdly small, herding geese across a field, but was a beginning. More small roles followed, and Duke absorbed everything he could about how movies were made. He watched directors frame shots, studied how editors shaped performances, and paid close attention to the business side of the industry. While other actors thought only about performing, Duke was thinking about the entire machinery of filmmaking. That early education would prove invaluable later when he started making financial decisions that went far beyond just cashing a paycheck. In 1930, director Raoul Walsh was casting a big-budget western called The Big Trail and needed a leading man with physical presence and raw energy. He spotted Duke Morrison and saw exactly what he was looking for. But there was a problem with the name. Marion Morrison was not a name that could carry a western epic. Walsh and the studio executives huddled together and came up with something more fitting. They considered names like Anthony Wayne, a nod to the Revolutionary War general Mad Anthony Wayne. Eventually, they settled on John Wayne. Simple, strong American. Duke Morrison became John Wayne on the day principal photography began. The Big Trail was an ambitious production, filmed using a widescreen format called Grandeur that required special cameras and projectors. The film had sweeping landscapes, massive wagon trains, and an epic scope that was genuinely ahead of its time. But the vision outpaced the infrastructure. Most theaters in America could not afford to install the equipment needed to project the widescreen format. The film played in standard format in most venues and flopped badly at the box office. John Wayne's big debut had become a very public failure. What followed was nearly a decade of grinding work in low-budget westerns known as B-movies. These were quick productions, often shot in days rather than weeks, with thin scripts, recycled sets, and minimal pay. John Wayne appeared in dozens of them throughout the early 1930s, churning out films for studios like Mascot, Monogram, and Republic. The critics ignored him. The major studios passed on him. But audiences in small towns and rural theaters kept showing up to watch him. He was developing a loyal following, even if nobody in Hollywood was paying attention yet. During those lean years, Wayne was building more than an audience. He was building a work ethic. He showed up on time, memorized his lines, never complained about the conditions, and always gave the production everything he had. Directors learned they could count on him. Studios appreciated his reliability. And Wayne himself was learning how the business worked from the inside out at every level. He was quietly becoming one of the most professionally valuable men in the industry, even when his name was nowhere near the top of the marquee. By 1939, John Wayne had been working in Hollywood for over a decade and was still considered a B-movie fixture. Then John Ford made a decision that rewrote everything. Ford had purchased the rights to a short story called Stage to Lordsbug by Ernest Haycox and was developing it into a film he titled Stagecoach. He had a vision for the picture, a tight ensemble piece set aboard a stagecoach crossing dangerous Apache territory, and he wanted John Wayne to play the Ringo Kid, a young outlaw with a code of honor. The major studios resisted. United Artists was skeptical about casting a B-movie actor in a prestige production. Ford fought for Wayne and won. Stagecoach premiered in February 1939 and was an immediate sensation. Critics celebrated it as a masterwork of the Western genre. Audiences could not get enough of it. The film received 7 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture and won 2 for Best Score and Best Supporting Actor for Thomas Mitchell. But perhaps more importantly for the long arc of Hollywood history, it turned John Wayne into a genuine movie star. The Ringo Kid was charming, brave, and deeply human in ways that no B-movie role had allowed Wayne to be. Audiences did not just enjoy the character. They fell in love with him. From that moment, John Wayne's career trajectory changed permanently. He moved into the ranks of genuine Hollywood stars, commanding real salaries, attracting major productions, and working with top directors. His partnership with John Ford deepened and became one of the defining creative relationships of Hollywood's golden age. Together, they made films that are still studied in cinema programs today. She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, Fort Apache, The Quiet Man, The Searchers, and many others. Each film reinforced Wayne's status, and each paycheck was substantially larger than the one before. The financial foundation of his future fortune was beginning to take shape. Success brought money, but money brought temptation, and John Wayne learned some of the hardest financial lessons of his life during his peak earning years. The first and most damaging came through a business manager named Bo Roos. Wayne, who spent most of his energy on making movies rather than managing money, handed Roos enormous authority over his finances. That trust turned out to be catastrophically misplaced. Roos steered Wayne into a series of disastrous investments, the worst of which involved a business venture in Panama that was essentially a fraud. Wayne lost approximately $700,000 in that single deal, an enormous sum in the 1950s. Additional failed investments connected to Roos's mismanagement pushed the total losses even higher. For a time, despite being one of the highest-paid actors in Hollywood, John Wayne was nearly broke. The second financial blow came from closer to home. Wayne allowed his oldest daughter's husband, Donald LaCava, to take a role in managing his finances. The results were no better. LaCava made poor decisions with Wayne's money, and the problems compounded quietly until they became impossible to ignore. The moment that crystallized the crisis for Wayne came when he received an overdue bill from Saks Fifth Avenue for $3,500. The bill had simply gone unpaid. For a man who had starred in dozens of major Hollywood productions, the humiliation of an unpaid department store account was a profound wake-up call. Wayne's response to these twin disasters revealed the deeper character that made him exceptional. He did not wallow in self-pity or make excuses. He took complete personal control of his finances, fired the managers who had failed him, and rebuilt his wealth through discipline and focus. He became deeply involved in every financial decision going forward. He asked hard questions, read every contract, and trusted his own judgment over the flattery of advisors. He committed to projects that paid well and reliably, avoided speculative investments, and began building the kind of diversified financial base that would eventually make him genuinely wealthy rather than just Hollywood wealthy, which is a different thing entirely. While John Wayne was rebuilding his finances, he was also expanding the range of his career in ways that deepened his cultural impact and his earning power simultaneously. The late 1940s and 1950s saw him move increasingly into war films, a genre that resonated powerfully with American audiences in the aftermath of World War II. In 1949, he starred in Sands of Iwo Jima, playing Sergeant John M. Stryker, a hard-driving Marine Corps drill instructor who leads his men into the brutal Pacific campaign. The performance was the most dramatically demanding of Wayne's career to that point, and it earned him his first Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. Sands of Iwo Jima was not just a critical achievement. It was a massive commercial success that expanded Wayne's audience beyond his Western fan base and established him as a credible dramatic actor. The film also deepened his connection with the American military community, a relationship that would define much of his public persona for the rest of his life. Wayne took great pride in the film's authenticity and its tribute to the men who had served. The career culmination came in 1969 with True Grit, directed by Henry Hathaway. Wayne played Rooster Cogburn, a one-eyed, hard-drinking, morally complicated United States Marshal hired by a teenage girl to hunt down her father's killer. It was unlike anything Wayne had played before. Cogburn was not noble or clean. He was flawed, funny, occasionally pathetic, and entirely human. Wayne had always been accused of playing himself on screen. True Grit demolished that criticism once and for all. His performance was a revelation, and on April 7, 1970, John Wayne walked to the stage at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion and accepted the Academy Award for Best Actor. The audience gave him a standing ovation. The Duke had finally received the recognition that decades of work had earned him. While John Wayne was building his legacy on screen, he was engaged in a far more private battle behind the scenes. In 1964, he was diagnosed with lung cancer, a consequence of the heavy smoking habit he had maintained for decades. At its peak, he reportedly smoked as many as 6 packs of cigarettes per day. Surgeons removed his entire left lung along with several ribs in a grueling operation. The medical community privately doubted he would survive. Many who knew him prepared for the worst. Wayne not only survived but returned to making films with remarkable speed. He refused to let the illness define him or diminish him, though he did eventually go public with his diagnosis in an effort to encourage other Americans to take cancer screening seriously. He spoke plainly about what he had gone through and urged people not to ignore warning signs as he had. For a man of his era and cultural stature, this kind of openness about a serious illness was unusual and courageous. There is also the deeply troubling story of The Conqueror, a 1956 film that was shot in the Utah desert near the St. George area, not far from where the United States government had been conducting above-ground nuclear weapons tests at the Nevada test site. The wind carried radioactive fallout across the filming locations where cast and crew worked for weeks. At the time, no one understood the danger they were walking into. Years later, researchers studying the health outcomes of the production found that an extraordinarily high percentage of the more than 200 people who worked on that film developed cancer. The numbers far exceeded what statistical chance would predict. John Wayne was among those who may have been exposed, and some researchers and journalists have long considered the film a potential contributing factor to the cancer diagnosis that plagued so many of its participants. Wayne faced stomach cancer in his later years as well, another brutal illness that he confronted with the same determined stoicism he had shown throughout his life. His final film, The Shootist, released in 1976, told the story of an aging gunfighter dying of cancer. The parallel to his real life was unmistakable. Wayne brought something to that role that no purely healthy actor could have replicated, the genuine knowledge of what it felt like to be running out of time. It was perhaps the most personal performance of his career. John Wayne died on June 11, 1979, at UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles. He was 72 years old. His death had been expected for some time, and yet the news hit with the weight of something unimaginable, because John Wayne had always seemed too substantial, too essential to American culture to actually be gone. President Jimmy Carter issued a statement calling him a symbol of the American spirit. Congress posthumously awarded him the Congressional Gold Medal. But it was the details of his estate that generated the most prolonged fascination. At the time of his death, Wayne's estate was valued at approximately $7 million. In today's purchasing power, that figure translates to somewhere in the range of $25 to $30 million. For a man who had nearly gone bankrupt twice, the scale of the fortune he had ultimately assembled was remarkable. His will was a document that reflected every major chapter of his complicated personal life. Wayne had been married 3 times. His first marriage was to Josephine Alicia Sines, a relationship that produced 4 of his 7 children: Michael, Mary, Patrick, and Melinda. His second marriage, to Esperanza Bauer, had been tumultuous and ended bitterly. His third marriage, to Pilar Palit, was the one that had endured the longest and produced his youngest 3 children: Isa, John Ethan, and Marissa. By the time of his death, Wayne and Pilar had been legally separated for years, and a prior financial agreement between them meant she had no claim to the estate. Wayne's will provided generously for all 7 of his children. Each received a portion of the estate, and Wayne took particular care to ensure that certain personal possessions of sentimental value were distributed thoughtfully. His first wife, Josephine, despite their divorce decades earlier, was provided for through a trust fund that would deliver regular payments to her for the remainder of her life, an acknowledgement of the years they had shared and the family they had built together. What attracted the most attention in Wayne's will, however, was not who he included, but who he deliberately left out. 2 people in particular stood out. His third wife Pilar's exclusion was explained, and perhaps understandable given their prior legal settlement. But the other deliberate exclusion was pointed and unmistakable in its intent. Donald LaCava, the husband of Wayne's oldest daughter Mary, was explicitly named in the will and explicitly barred from ever receiving or controlling any portion of the estate. Wayne had not forgotten or forgiven LaCava's mismanagement of his finances years earlier. More than just leaving him out, Wayne structured Mary's inheritance with specific provisions designed to ensure that even if she predeceased her husband, LaCava would have no access to the money. The inheritance was set up to pass to Mary's children or other designated beneficiaries, bypassing LaCava entirely regardless of circumstances. The will also remembered people outside the immediate family circle who had served Wayne faithfully over the years. 2 longtime secretaries who had worked with him for decades each received substantial gifts, tens of thousands of dollars, a recognition of loyalty and service that many employers of Wayne's stature would have overlooked. That Wayne remembered them, in writing, in a legal document that represented his final statement to the world, says something important about the kind of man he was beneath the public mythology. The overall architecture of the will told a coherent story. It was the document of a man who had thought carefully about who had helped him, who had hurt him, and who deserved to benefit from what he had spent a lifetime building. It was disciplined, purposeful, and completely free of sentimentality that would have compromised the interests of people he genuinely cared about. The same qualities that had made him rebuild his finances after nearly losing everything were visible in every clause.